Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Lingo, and I'm the interim dean here in the College of Education and Human Development at U of L. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today as we hear from Dr. Ahmad Washington. Dr. Geneva Stark, the director of our Nystrand Center for Excellence in Education, will be moderating this webinar and will be introducing Dr. Washington. Again, welcome, and we are so glad that you are here. Dr. Stark?
Hey, thank you, Dr. Lingo, for the welcome. Truly appreciate it, and we appreciate your work. We appreciate your commitment to the Nystrand Center of Excellence in Education as we continue to provide an avenue or be a liaison between higher education, our community, and also K-12 education. Many times when we are looking at speakers, we look outward. This time we decide to look inward. And we saw Dr. Ahmad Washington, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Human Development at the University of Louisville. He teaches in the school counseling program where he works with pre-service school counseling students as they prepare to transition into the profession. Dr. Washington received his BS in psychology from Francis Marion University, his MA in clinical counseling from Webster University, and his PhD in counselor education and supervision from the University of Iowa in 2013. Dr. Washington's scholarship engages audiences across a multitude of platforms. Rather than submit exclusively to the peer review outlets, he decides to make sure that everyone has access to his information, because sometimes it becomes insulated and racially homogeneous and financially inaccessible. To large swaths of Black people, he publishes is more accessible in various spaces. He is currently finalizing what will be the initial entry of a blog he will curate on Psychology Today titled The Misfits of the Moynihan. Ideally, this blog will serve as a way of deliberately facilitating conversation about anti-Blackness and decolonization in the helping professions with a wider audience. He is co-editor of the new book, Creating and Sustaining Effective K-12 School Partnerships, firsthand accounts of promising practices. Dr. Washington's article, Using Hip-Hop Culture and Rap Music in Counseling Black Men, was published in 2018 in the Journal of Counseling and Development, the flagship peer-reviewed journal of the counseling profession. It was featured article in the American Counseling Association website in January 2018. His most recent article, Using a Critical Hip-Hop School Counseling Framework to Promote Black Consciousness Among Black Boys, will be included in an upcoming issue of Professional School Counseling, the premier journal in the field. Dr. Washington has received various counseling-related awards recognizing his work, including the first annual Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development, the Asa Hilliard Scholarship Award. He has also been recognized repeatedly by colleagues and students for his classroom instruction as a University of Louisville faculty favorite. And again, today we want to welcome Dr. Ahmad Washington, who is a professor at the University of Louisville. Dr. Washington, we're happy to have you.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, Dean Lingo for starting us off this afternoon, and Dr. Stark for that very robust and warm and thoughtful and considerate introduction. I really appreciate it. Today, I'm going to talk about one of my things that I'm most passionate about as it pertains to education, but also counseling. And I'm attempting to share my screen, and I don't know if I have those capabilities as of yet. So I have some slides that I want to show. Is it possible to make my screen shareable?
You should be a co-host and you should have that capability.
see.
Brandon, Dr. Craddock.
Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Cannot see it yet.
You
Okay.
should have the ability to share a share screen option now, Dr. Washington.
Okay. Ah, there we go. Let's see.
And as Dr. Washington gets ready, his topic is pedagogy as power, imagining possibilities and embracing a radical future.
So can everyone see this?
Yes.
All right. So let's get started. Again, my title is Pedagogy as Power, Imagining Possibilities and Embracing a Radical Future. I am someone who is deeply entrenched in the Black radical tradition. And part of that radical tradition encompasses critical race theory, which I will discuss in parts throughout my talk today. But part of critical race theory, if you're familiar with the tenets of critical race theory in education, is for the author, the person speaking, to situate themselves with relationship to the topic. So that's what I'll do today. I'll offer some insights, some personal narratives about my experiences with education and use those to sort of pivot and transition to a broader conversation and critique of education, counseling and its conservative sort of ideals, and implore the audience to think about more radical possibilities in education. So let me begin. Many of my fondest and most vivid recollections from early childhood through early and late adulthood have occurred in very close proximity to schools. Those interpersonal relationships, the rewarding participation in extracurricular activities and scholastic sports, the adolescent exposure to institutions of higher learning have all contributed greatly to my growth and maturation. And that's a perspective that I think many of you on the call can find familiar. However, what cannot be forgotten and overshadowed, though, is that despite these salient and life-altering experiences, they unfolded within a socially constructed and ideologically driven institution, the compulsory school, that has been historically negligent and gratuitous in its abuses against racialized students, especially Black children. Therefore, it is important and incumbent for me as a contributor to educational discourse in some small way to critique how theories of education and conventional ideas about schooling and schools that deny the trauma that Black children endure and mischaracterize the survival strategies that Black children deploy. In response, I am a Black American man that was reared in the rural South, South Carolina specifically. My racial consciousness was shaped by broad public discourse and specific public policies, and I'm thinking here about the rise of the super predator, that directly or indirectly decried Black America. Pathological depictions and characterizations of Blackness in the 1980s abounded and were weaponized politically to engender public support for draconian policies that adversely impacted countless friends, relatives, and associates. We'll talk about that within the current context of education when we talk about standardized testing, hyper-policing, and the saturation of urban schools with police officers while they are routinely denied access to very, very vital mental health services. Developing a more nuanced understanding of the symbiotic relationship between ideological, and here I mean Black representing pathology, and institutional power, and the sociogenesis of Black pain and suffering constitutes the foundation of my research and pedagogical practice. I am particularly interested in excavating the ways Black people, especially young Black people, negotiate the compensatory K-12 education system, how they also mobilize alternative ways of being and existing, particularly through HipHop, that are often castigated as non-compliant or defiant when evaluated using homogenizing Eurocentric standards of behavior. This is by no means peripheral to my analysis, it is central. And it's also central to my engagement with the subject around education. So, promoting the 3 R's is perhaps one of the most foundational responsibilities associated with the teaching profession and also counseling. Reading, writing, and arithmetic have been deemed the basis of most popular notions of what mandatory public education should ideally entail. Few would argue or debate the inherent significance of the ability to read, for instance. Countless notable historical figures have articulated the conviction that the ability to read is absolutely paramount. Reading stimulates the imagination, enables imaginative excursions to uncharted destinations, and helps foster deeper and richer patterns of communication. Relatedly, writing provides the ability to extend and inject your personhood into and onto the physical and social worlds. It is an act of agency and empowerment to chronicle and describe the world, to reimagine possibilities through the written word. Arithmetic, the ability to properly formulate and calculate equations, to add, subtract, and divide, is an equally important endeavor. Again, no one would argue the merits of any of these facets of what is commonly accepted as the components of mandatory K through 12 education.
Dr. Washington, excuse me, but you're only on one slide. I'm not sure if you know that. We're still on slide one. Okay,
Yes.
good.
However, establishing a consensus regarding the purpose of education is a much more tenuous process. There is a predominant idea perverting our culture that education is primarily a personal investment made for the express purpose of advancing a student's individual economic predicament. Human capital theory in education espouses the idea that students operate in their own individual interests, right? Procuring the needed content and tangible skill set to make themselves more appealing to prospective employers in a competitive, technologically advanced global marketplace. Now, if you were to conduct a cursory review of most school district websites, you will find some overarching educational mission wherein successfully educating students are those students who have attained the requisite tools to compete for limited vacancies on college campuses in academic programs and disciplines and related professions in an attempt to accumulate wealth. This expressed emphasis, and this is why I'm staying on this screen for so long, this expressed emphasis on rugged individualism and hyper competition is unsurprising when we understand that an abiding thread of the American ethos are competition and rugged individualism. The narrative of American exceptionalism, the idea of American exceptionalism, the romantic, persuasive, and self-aggrandizing idea that America is unique and exemplary, is buttressed and fortified by the premise that the best and the brightest are entitled and deserve more than others. The notion that the best and the brightest are more entitled and more deserving comes from the premise that they have sacrificed and exhibited a work ethic that their lazy, uninspired, and unimaginative counterparts have not. This has been referred to as the myth of meritocracy, that success in the society is in proportion to your own hard work, is widely believed to account almost completely for the existing social structure and pervasive and enduring social disparities and inequalities that plague this society. Intertwined with this notion of American exceptionalism and the myth of meritocracy is the assumption that barriers to integration and upward social mobility, namely racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression that previously plagued this country, have been largely ameliorated, and that racist, sexist, and xenophobic incidents are perpetuated by individual bad apples. With these barriers to social inclusion removed, or so the argument goes, America can justifiably proclaim itself as a post-racial utopia, where an egalitarian idea of difference blindness or color blindness ultimately prevails. Now, this is where this conversation is extremely important and relevant to teaching, but also counseling and other helping professions. Within education, this is especially profound because more than 80% of the teaching profession is comprised of individuals who identify themselves as white. And the reality, and this is quoting Mitchell Smith from 2007, the reality is that many professional school counselors are of the majority race and presumably have been socialized in the same American ethnocentric curriculum and school system that disservices marginalized students. In this context, a mostly white education workforce often commits itself to not seeing race and treating students of color like their own children. But I ask, what are the implications on students of color when they are conditioned to emulate whites on the matters of race and racism? Specifically, the tendency of white educators to derail conversations and discussions about the ongoing salience of race and racism and the demands of racial justice that come directly from students themselves. Asking or expecting Black students to conscientiously operate from a difference blindness or race neutral perspective or post-racial perspective To preserve a narrative of American exceptionalism runs counter to historical evidence about how race and the ideology of white supremacy remain integral to the crystallization of a collective white American consciousness in our racially stratified society. These deeply entrenched and related myths have been the cornerstone of this country. And I don't know if any of you all have seen these comments this week, but this is where I talk about the connection between this ideology and what is habitually and consistently taught in classrooms, particularly in areas like social study. These deeply entrenched and related myths have been the cornerstone of this country and a national consciousness regarding the promise and possibilities of education. This is a pedagogy grounded in a premise of objectivity and neutrality. This is the sentiment that suggests the operationalized educational standards represent developmental learning milestones we believe students should aspire to. These standards essentially act as guideposts, directing and guiding us towards learning environments and outcomes where students demonstrate mastery. Standards and content are promoted as objective and neutral, supposedly operating from an unbiased and universal perspective, a paradigm or belief system about what is knowledge and how knowledge is measured and understood that does not unjustifiably advantage anyone. But on the contrary, these perspectives are far from neutral. For many, these perspectives on education are designed with the intent of indoctrinating students to enthusiastically embrace and pledge blind allegiance to the cultural practices wedded to the popular and romantic narrative of American exceptionalism and all that it entails. I don't know how many of you all are familiar, but this is probably one of the most iconic photographs in social studies texts that I've ever seen, directly or vicariously. This is rather iconic because of how it sort of exemplifies and captures the sentiment expressed by Rick Santorum. So I'm going to transition here and talk about how this shows up as it pertains to colonization and domination. According to Sartre, the European elite undertook to manufacture a native elite. They picked out promising adolescents, they branded them, as with a red hot iron, with the principles of Western culture. Sartre's words illuminate how the normalization of Western imperialism through schooling and counseling provides a more expansive framework of the idea of school as racial enclosures. Operating from this perspective, I seek to understand and encourage my students to understand this as well, how schooling and counseling are related, not divergent, as unique entities and also as co-conspirators to circumscribe Black and Brown and Indigenous forms of critical thought that are essential to Black and Brown and Indigenous forms of critical thinking. Some examples of this include circulating the mythology of Columbus's discovery, or the ingenuity and benevolence of the founding fathers, or how the colonists are venerated for seeking the implementation of imperial rule, the expectation that students will recite the pledge with conviction, right? When students are introduced to the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers, for instance, are they also taught how those revolutionary ideas were used to construct a racial caste system that was predicated on their relegation and existence at the absolute bottom of the social calendar, social hierarchy? Are those students attuned to the persistent erasure of Indigenous people and Black people and how demeaning tropes are mobilized to dehumanize and disempower those groups? For Black students, is it important that they understand how the narrative of American exceptionalism, American progress, a narrative that is initiated by resilient and ingenious, hardworking men on the frontiers of this country, is totally incomplete? I want students to understand how that narrative, again, is totally incomplete with the presence of an unyielding savage, a seemingly untamable nemesis. This nemesis is fashioned as the antithesis to progress, culturally backwards, susceptible to superstition and vice, and devoid of any form of legitimate and recognizable culture. These savages, so the story goes, must be eradicated as part of a pervasive theological order wherein the colonists were divinely obligated to violently decimate and displace. The lethality of these tropes is even more fully understood when we understand them, to quote Castro Gomez, as examples of epistemic violence. So what does this mean more pointedly in terms of policy and procedure in education? From this perspective, the often discussed achievement gap is attributed to chronic undervaluing of education that afflicts communities of color, Black urban communities most especially. Unlike the popular theories of biological essentialism that claim Black students' challenges were a function of their innate disadvantages, newer critical theories sought to correct students' cultural disadvantages and deficiencies. Cultural deficiency theories of education are still powerful and extremely attractive because they implicate students, their families, and their communities. This orientation to teaching, though it is characterized, again, as neutral, objective, and well-intentioned, still has very, very profound social and political implications. This assertion is important in countering the claim that education can and should be divorced from the realm of political discourse. Not surprisingly, these ideologies and myths have functioned as the primary impediments to the implementation of widespread recreation or reimagining of how schooling is conceptualized and disseminated in this country. This recreated pedagogy, which I'm wanting to talk more about here, unlike its capitalist-driven alternative, invites and encourages students to critique the worlds that they occupy. This is a pedagogy that prioritizes students taking an active role in altering the trajectory of the world rather than dutifully assimilating to it. This framework for radicalizing education is, in my opinion, has to become the new status quo. In other words, the new normal. Helping Black students to discern the continuity of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. Helping Black students to discern the continuity of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism as they exist at the intersection of schooling and society writ large. Black students deserve space to critique how the traditional K-12 American educational system uses blatant and veiled dehumanizing practices to coerce them into disavowing and disassociating from their communities and cultures of origin. This Black disavow and disassociation is essential in the schooling process because schools are interested in promoting reverence for prevailing patriarchal social mores and models of decorum, and deference to narrow conceptions of literacy and academic success. And here I'm thinking about Bettina Love's vital work on abolitionist schooling. Black children are coerced into seeking white recognition as a stimulus to a healthy sense of self-understanding, which fundamentally represents a form of pathology. As we know, Black students receive severe retribution for deviating from any Anglo-normative social codes, whether that's displaying aesthetic signifiers of Blackness, hairstyles, and attire, to enforce a law and order environment inside of schools where Black children frequently attend. So I want to call your attention to this article by Connie Woon, The Anti-Black Order of No Child Left Behind, using Lacanian psychoanalysis and critical race theory to examine NCLB. And this is very, very important in making the connection between this emphasis on standardized testing and the socio-political implications of always positioning Black students as less than or problematic. This is important when we consider several widely publicized, gut-wrenching incidents of physical violence unleashed against Black K-12 students that were recorded and circulated on social media. And I won't belabor the point about going into any details about the vivid and graphic nature of those activities. However, punitive disciplinary action, which is particularly common in urban schools with predominantly Black and brown students, engenders a school climate where antipathy and psychological, emotional, and physical disregard are very commonplace. These oppressive zero tolerance behavioral policies are anchored to an Anglo-normative logic rooted in the ideals of white supremacy and anti-Blackness that criminalize the behaviors and cultural aesthetics that some students choose to perform and embody. The school-to-prison pipeline and the predominant banking concept of education are byproducts of a pervasive racial ideology. This ideology seeks to subdue students' liberatory imaginations through a discourse of pathology or at-riskness that deems Black and brown students ineducable and disposable because of their presumed flaws are considered insurmountable and thus too costly to address. Now, this is where I want to turn and pivot to some of the activities and examples that I've actually had the privilege to implement there in Louisville, but also across the spectrum of my educational career, teaching and also inside the classroom as a counselor educator. So a few quotes that I want to cite as it pertains to the manipulation and control of people's language. And here I cite H. Sami Alim. Policing language is a form of social control that amounts to nothing less than policing people. We begin with language as power. That is the view that language is the revolution, a powerful discourse in and of itself. I'm fascinated by the possibilities of a critical pedagogy rooted in a ubiquitous youth-driven movement like hip hop culture. I'm also intrigued by how the intersection of critical pedagogy and hip hop might engender an enduring engagement between decolonial discourse and school counseling and education more broadly. Students' hip hop sensibilities are a compass for traversing overlapping American social, political, and cultural spheres where anti-Black oppression happens through the institutionalization of anti-Black ideologies and policies. Many of hip hop's aesthetics and vernacular forms have been theorized as deliberate expressions of socio-political opposition to the algorithms of anti-Blackness that produced the socio-economic context, and I'm quoting Jeffries here, that produced the socio-economic context that relegated people of color in urban areas to the rubble and shadow of our modernizing projects. Thus, not surprisingly, the vibrancy and youthful exuberance of hip hop has been vital in articulating a future where the anti-Black violence enacted by the state and rogue vigilantes ceases to exist. Ultimately, this critical hip hop pedagogy, whereby students are given free rein to compose counter narratives that resist the smear campaigns that depict them as unlovable, undeserving, uneducable, and ultimately disposable. And these are some of the things, some of the questions, and a general framework and orientation that I often broach with students around critical thinking. That when we think about hip hop, how can hip hop empower and embolden us to ask questions like who benefits, who is this thing harmful to, and what other perspectives and alternatives and counter narratives exist. So I'll speak more specifically about how I use this critical thinking sheet to address issues that are recurrently coming up in my interactions with young Black men in schools. So the first thing I've used hip hop to critique and engage is the idea of incremental multiculturalism. The discourse on multiculturalism that has governed counseling and education since the late 1970s reflects an incrementalist and colonial conception of difference, diversity, and inclusion that cannot account for the uniqueness and specificity of anti-Blackness. As multiculturalism acknowledges and rewards respectful dialogue, symbolic cultural exchanges, and the assimilation of marginalized groups into the dominant white social structure as signs of racial progress, it simultaneously, multiculturalism does, mutes or ignores important conversations about how racial power initiates Black disenfranchisement in the first place. We see this aversion in data, exposing the levels of uneasiness and discomfort counselors often demonstrate. And I wouldn't confine this to just school counselors. I've seen this, I've experienced this with teachers and other educational leaders. This discomfort when the utterance of race occurs within the context of counseling and teaching. Incremental multiculturalism, specifically the assimilation of marginalized groups into dominant structures, can be witnessed in how hip hop culture is utilized domestically, but also abroad. Through meticulous analysis, Black boys can consider the ways hip hop is used to circulate the idea of a post-racial and inclusive American landscape where everyone has the opportunity to achieve upward social mobility through initiative and hard work in an ostensible meritocratic society. D revealed that since the mid-2000s, the US State Department has been using hip hop culture to disseminate a regretful and rehabilitated image of America as a land of unending opportunity where social stagnation could no longer be ascribed to systemic injustice. Black boys might be asked to consider how the proliferation of hip hop domestically and globally and the visibility of Black artists internationally might be used to reinforce the idea that a truly egalitarian society has already been achieved. Conversations and questions like these can be connected to courses and post-secondary careers Black boys could pursue, including political science or sociology. Data and excerpts from texts about the hyper visibility of racial minorities, young Black men in hip hop, or President Obama, for instance, is used to often dismiss accusations of racism to reinforce the myth of meritocracy and the existence of a colorblind society could be integrated to deepen these discussions. Lastly, Black boys can be invited to share rap lyrics or other facets of hip hop culture that speak to this paradox of hyper visibility and invisibility and how they experience the paradox themselves. Also, providing Black boys the opportunities to frequently interrogate the ways in which race is remade through the professions and institutions where they navigate. Here I want to pivot to how this shows up within counseling and counseling psychology. Ideally, these opportunities would be afforded to counseling psychology and counseling students to think about the ways that they transition through these comprehensive preparatory programs and departments in adherence to major accrediting standards and expectations. So here, I don't know if any of you all are aware or how many of you all are aware of the recent apology that was administered by the American Psychiatric Association. And this is what I'm connecting to when I think about how can these critical conversations be more meaningful and engage more consistently with the graduate students and undergraduates we engage when we think about race, counseling, and education. Unfortunately, professional orientation, and here I'm thinking about professional school counseling, as the foundational course typically offered first in most counseling sequences, is a broad sweeping overview of germinal ideas and pivotal events that propel counseling from being perceived publicly as psychology's inferior sibling, a fledgling vocation at best, to a respected and viable profession in its own right. A brief perusal of the most popular textbooks used for professional orientation reveals that the profession is overwhelmingly portrayed in an endearing and glowing fashion as a staunch advocate for dignity, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and they bend towards the most basic principles of humanism. In these texts, there isn't a shred of evidence that even intimates that the profession of counseling and other related fields, here I'm thinking about psychology and sociology, aside from a few noteworthy and regrettable exceptions, had done anything except operate in the collective interest of all humanity. As a consequence, and I've seen this time and time again in my own classrooms, students receive a very whitewashed and romanticized articulation of the profession's past that does not implicate or hold itself accountable for its pervasive, passive and active role in initiating, accelerating, and sustaining ideologies and practices that instigate social travesties and miscarriages of justice. And while practitioners from subjugated communities have leveraged these considerable insights into attempts to dismantle barriers to justice, thinking about Mamie and Kenneth Clark, counseling and other related professions are rooted in ideologies that have helped structures and systems of domination metastasize and harden, quite literally offering tacit and explicit approval for the disposability of non-beings deemed unworthy of the category human. I also want students to think about how they can think about the connections between Black dispossession, but also Indigenous dispossession and Indigenous erasure. So here I talk about how hip hop is a fantastic way to think about those overlapping forms of oppression and how economic exploitation undergirds them both. Another premise that I want to engage reflects the need to discuss how neoliberalism in education, this corporate business model that guides education, and the divestment of public goods is at the center of urban public schooling and urban school counseling. This is rarely discussed in school counseling literature expressly, even as evidence of neoliberalism's disproportionate adverse impact on Black and brown students continue to mount. And I'm thinking about forms of physical violence and school closures in Black and brown communities especially. Silence is customary because Black students are generally seen as highly flawed, uninterested in education, and therefore undeserving of legal protection and moral and financial support. The threats to the public good brought about through neoliberalism can be examined by a discussion of the clean water crisis in Flint, Michigan, for instance. Hip hop artists have been some of the most vocal and outspoken advocates for the mostly Black residents of Flint who still have not received justice. In Flint, the mostly Black residents were exposed to toxic and contaminated water when the city made the decision to shift its water source from Lake Huron and the Detroit River to the Flint River as a cost-cutting measure. The consequences have been catastrophic and the situation is still being rectified. As May's 2016 points out, the Flint crisis provides a unique opportunity for Black students to see how the confluence of political deregulation, privatization of public services, and capitalism that contributed to the crisis in Flint is not unlike the disregard and displacement experienced by indigenous people protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Further, Black boys can also consider how these two environmental crises mirror the displacement politically disenfranchised Black and brown youth experienced in the Bronx, the place of hip hop's birth, when the Cross Bronx Expressway was designed and erected between 1948 and 1963. School counselors can couple Mays' examination of hip hop critiques of Flint and the Dakota Access Pipeline with the critique of the Cross Bronx Expressway that occurs in the Netflix series The Get Down to illustrate how privatization, capitalism, and the wanton disregard for the lives of Black and brown and indigenous people help crystallize a posture of resistance that has, and in many ways is still central to hip hop culture. The last thing that I want to broach is creating a safe space where Black boys can more honestly engage the things that transpire in their lives. And I have always wanted to talk about this incident that transpired in 2016. A young man named Tahini Epps was actually reprimanded for doing something that he thought he was instructed to do. So I'll read a little bit more about that and begin to bring this conversation to a close. The last thing that I want to point out is the need to create spaces that are safe and secure for Black students in schools. The need for school counselors, teachers, and other educational leaders to build alternative third spaces for Black students where subversive forms of dialogue, expression, processing, and production are not only allowed, but they are thoroughly encouraged. These spaces could serve to expose schools' roles in promoting the European romanticism I've talked about, how these schools engage in spiteful tactics to negate students' counter narratives, examine how the social sciences, like the American Psychiatric Association, the tendency to describe, explain, and predict individual and social behavior overshadows Black and brown students' attempts to agitate larger, wide-scale social transformation. And there are countless examples, but the one about Tahini Epps is the one that I would like to illuminate here. Tahini Epps Jr., for instance, in 2016 was an 11-year-old middle schooler in an affluent, mostly white school district in Maryland. During Ban the Books week, Tahini misunderstood a directive from his teacher. Now, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but Kidiana thought that he had been asked to portray something in this society he wanted to be stopped or banned. He drew a picture of a Black man being lynched by 2 members of the KKK. Believing he was intending to hurt himself, Tahini's teachers referred him to a mental health counselor for an evaluation, and he was not permitted to return to school unless he promised not to harm himself. Now, some might say this was a very sincere opportunity or an engagement with Tahini to ensure that he didn't harm himself, but I want to ask this question or ask that we consider this alternative. That how about this is an explicit example? How about using this as an explicit engagement with hip hop that attempts to gauge the merit and success of education for Black boys based on the extent to which that education helps them deal with the first question of their lives, which is, how do I survive as a Black person in a white racist country? All right, so Although some folks might perceive the intervention by the school to be sincere and genuine, I want to think about what possibilities were foreclosed by taking that very hasty response to what seemed like a critical interrogation with things happening around him. So in closing, data has revealed that consistent exposure to trauma, whether that trauma is simple, meaning one occurrence, or acute or complex, can have deleterious impacts on school-aged children's sense of safety, their sense of school belonging, self-confidence, academic performance, and social relationships. Let me advance these slides. Because these domains are foundational to students' holistic wellness and academic performance, the need to intervene and eradicate trauma exposure and its varied ecological sources is indisputable. Traditionally, trauma-informed care has focused on providing students with the necessary skills to manage the psychosocial and emotional turmoil brought about by trauma. Pragmatically then, trauma-informed care has entailed disseminating strategies for lessening the impact of trauma. As important and as vital as these strategies are, this approach often minimizes or neglects altogether a serious consideration for the sociological antecedents of trauma and its attendant psychosocial consequences. In this contemporary moment, it feels incomprehensible to divorce operational definitions of trauma, harm, and care from the current socio-political landscape. It feels dishonest and disingenuous for conversations about trauma and trauma-informed care to occur without considering how racism and other forms of social oppression pervade social institutions and social systems where marginalized students are habitually exposed to forms of psychological and physical trauma. Therefore, when our approach to education obscures Black children's reality for the sake of molding them into a competitive global marketplace, we actually endorse a framework of white supremacy and settler colonialism that wreaks havoc in the world and the lives of Black people. We are therefore faced with a conundrum. How do we continue to subscribe to the mission of preparing students to assimilate the tenets of settler colonialism and capitalism, while also proclaiming to be beacons of social and racial justice? How do we reconcile perspectives that feel inherently irreconcilable? Thank you.
You're muted, Geneva.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. And we still have another 45 minutes to go because we end at 4:30. You mentioned about, for the audience, briefly mentioned navigating racial battle fatigue. Can you share with the audience, what is racial battle fatigue? And what does that mean what is racial battle fatigue?
So racial battle fatigue, I don't think it can be whittled down or confined to one thing necessarily. I think it's a suite of experiences, encounters, responses, and antagonisms that often occur, and I'm thinking about within the context of higher education in this current moment, for instance, that if the institution or a department or a program says that it's interested in, excuse my perspiring, it's kind of warm where I am, that as we're looking to intervene in these systems, the folks who have the most immediate and most intimate details about how that system adversely impacts them are often hailed and invited to be participants in that conversation. And then based on my own experiences and conversations with others, the fatigue comes from being invited to a conversation and your contributions to the discourse not being taken seriously, right? So I've been really thinking about that as it transpires, as we experience it, as Black and brown folks experience it, and other marginalized folks. It's a form of gaslighting, right? And that's where the implications have to be have to be understood in terms of what does it do to the psyche of a person who is saying that systemic forms of oppression and racism are barriers, and others are saying back to you that your assessment of the world is invalid. Right? That's exhausting, right? And for me, that's a part of what encompasses and what describes racial battle fatigue. I have myriad other examples, right? It's exhausting, for instance, to teach theories that don't speak to my existence, the existence of most students who will matriculate through JCPS schools. And I'm thinking, for instance, about a theory of existentialism as it pertains to how school counselors conduct their business. And having taught theory this semester, I'm fascinated by the number of students who have not been oriented to asking whose existence are we talking about here? A very fundamental, very basic question. And just asking the question alone just leaves the opportunity for these alternative ways of being that I think, if taken seriously and prioritized, would help eliminate a lot of the racial battle fatigue that I experience and other folks who look like me experience.
Okay. Because we hear that, and again, not only in institutions, but also in community as well. And right now we know in Louisville, there's the Department of Justice have arrived to look at the LMPD department because, of some of the improprieties or alleged improprieties that has happened, and specifically Breonna Taylor. How do we move individuals, or do you have any comments in terms of with the community being, exhausted with everything that's happened, or the country being exhausted? What strategies can we use to get beyond that, or to move individuals from inaction to action? What should be the solution? Because we talk about, we know what the problems are.
I'm glad that you mentioned that right there. We know what the problems are. I would argue that we don't.
Okay.
I would argue that we don't. And part of, I think, my engagement with theory and making sure students understand the connection between theory and practice is, I have several progressive, liberal leaning white students in my class, and they are in one moment adamant about needing to rectify the system, right? And not be able to hear how an emphasis on meritocratic and meritocracy first is a contradiction with the idea that there are systemic impediments and barriers to determining who has access to what and when, right? So I would just respond to the assumption that we know how we got here, is because I've been in far too many conversations where literally the first question is, and it's not a rhetorical question, how did we get here, right? And for me, that feels like another example of gaslighting that produces or exacerbates the racial fatigue we just alluded to, right? I don't know how about the folks on this call, but there have been several conversations I've been in, consultations with folks who look at the January 6th incident. And if I ask them to describe in any detail what transpired, what they saw in terms of the iconography and the icons or the images or the rhetoric and the language, and they literally look at me and they don't have a clue, right? And the ability to disconnect the very vivid and graphic language and images that we saw that are often associated with the Confederacy, and the ability to disconnect the January 6th incident and not being able to connect it, right, in a way that shows the continuity of anti-Blackness, is just another example that we collectively don't know how we got here, right? And I want to more consistently interrogate how traditional compulsory education, with its emphasis on romanticizing this country, is integral in contributing to that sort of cultural amnesia, right? That sort of amnesia that allows everybody to say, I don't know how we got here, right? When there are literally folks who are telling you every day of their lives that we're here because this is how the creation of this country existed, right? And folks who are adamant, because they've internalized and ingested that romantic notion, that they can't reconcile, that there's a form of cognitive dissonance that won't allow folks to see an alternative explanation for how we got here.
So with that, how do those individuals, like I said, who are disconnected, and there are many, who, like, as you stated, that don't know why or how. But in moving forward, how do we, or what do we need to do to connect the dots for individuals who have not connected the dots? What can we do moving forward? Because as we saw at the insurrection January the 6th, there were a lot of people that were there. So
there were a lot of people that weren't, right?
Correct.
Like,
yes.
I think about, like, what about the folks who weren't there?
Correct.
Right? What about the January the 6th? What occurred on January the 6th is a function of folks who have had to learn to ignore the warning signs that were posted as early as 2015 that white supremacists and militia members had infiltrated police departments, right? Like, at what point do we say the folks who can't get it or don't get it is actually an exercise that's exacerbating my racial battle fatigue? Like, I think that's part of the conversation also. Like, how much of the not knowing about how we got here is deliberate, right? Intentional ignorance, right? And I'm just invested in and excited by these spaces where folks are coming, wanting to find and learn alternative explanations, as opposed to trying to convince someone that this is something that they should prioritize and take seriously.
And as we all know that the university has declared themselves, as want to become one day premier anti-racist universities. And the question becomes, what does that mean? What does that mean? And because again, we can talk, what does that mean? And what action needs to happen at the educational institution? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, they go from the mundane to the large in scale, right? So how often have you as an educator been in spaces where someone says, for instance, the Socratic method to learning? So I can start with something very mundane and very simple, because there are so many ways to not just promote yourself as an anti-racist institution, but one that says and recognizes that in order to be anti-racist, I must grapple with capitalism and the fact that we occupy indigenous land. Like, there's so many things that have to be taken into consideration before the proclamation of anti-racist agenda is even feasible, right? Like, how do you even conceptualize what that entails? What programs have to be radically altered? And what does that radical alteration look like when oftentimes, based on my experiences and conversations, that the thing that functions as the curriculum in many of our disciplines is nothing but the ideas that emerged out of European Enlightenment. And literally there aren't alternative models for learning and existing that are promoted, right? And I literally think about, to do the things that the administration seems so eager to do literally requires the remaking of our institution, right? It requires a very serious consideration of the types of students we recruit, right? Are we willing to, is the aspiration to become that institution, right? Is it so important? Is it so critical? Is it so meaningful that we're willing to take the economic cost associated with implementing something that seems fundamentally so radical? And again, that's a question for other people to answer.
Okay. And I get that. And also, right now in our country, with the climate and culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, sense of belonging, all those words are thrown around very, very loosely. Now they become buzzwords. Can you speak to that in terms of,
Well, yeah, I think when I started and I talked about critical race theory, I want to use critical race theory as a lens so that when it becomes apparent that that language and that jargon has a particular economic and social cachet, right? Just simply asking, how is this circulation of this discourse, particularly if it isn't followed up with some form of sustainable changes in the academy itself, how is that another form of interest convergence, where just the ability to say this is what we're committed to actually works to the benefit of the institution and not on behalf of the folks who are supposedly centered in those initiatives themselves. So I think about the parallels between a civil rights act, for instance, and a voting rights act, and what those two forms of legislation did within and for domestic policy in terms of interconvergence. Like, what did it do for the country at that particular moment to say, we recognize and acknowledge that we've been treating Black and brown folks deplorably, right? So how does that legislation as a form of interest convergence advance the institution's interests? I think is also a way to critique and hold accountable institutions when they say they are invested in anti-racism. Simply asking, is this another form of interest convergence? And if so, how? And if it is, in what ways can we move towards a more meaningful transformational structure, one that doesn't simply pay lip service to a set of ideas that has tremendous social and political cachet in the moment?
Yeah. Thank you. And does anyone have any questions from our attendees?
Can I ask you?
Well, I was going to ask you another question.
Oh,
I teach diversity in the workforce class, and the students had to go out and research, companies, and what they found was that there is a statement, a D&I statement, but as they dug deeper, they didn't see any meat to it. And so they were disheartened because they saw some of these major companies and institutions that had very nice and eloquent DEI statements, but nothing behind it. Also, when they look at the structure of the company and they saw the C-suite and who it represented, and at the entry level positions and who they represented, they were like, really? And I challenged them to be able to, as they have seen this information and realize this, that to go out and do something about it. Because I'm of the mantra that bad things happen when good people stand by and do nothing. And again, we can talk about the surface piece, but what is going to be the action plan behind it?
Yeah, I guess I'm always thinking about, and to go back to some of the slides that I presented, I'm always asking the students that I work with and colleagues and conversations that pertain to the conversation of this topic is, what happens? What happens when a person who represents the dispossessed or the disenfranchised becomes elevated or promoted, right? What can also be made possible, right? What does that also enable? Does it inspire? Does it motivate? Does it encourage young people to say, like, wow, never before did I think that was conceivable, that was possible, and I'm going to pursue it too. The thing that I'm always asking is, if we are thinking about education and what it means to and for dispossessed Black and brown folks, is that the orientation that Black and brown folks have always had to education? And just based on my reviews, it's no. That if education has been only or exclusively or primarily the means to an end, that in many ways is incongruent with how Black folks have thought about, protected, prioritized education ever since emancipation, right? And I think that's a part that oftentimes gets overlooked, is what we know in terms of universal education. That is exclusively the function of emancipated Africans as they were walking off the plantation. right? The building of those institutions, school in particular, the reassembly of those families, school was important, was a priority, right? So the idea that those sorts of like education doesn't matter or isn't meaningful to Black and brown folks is just inconsistent. It's just very, very inconsistent.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much. I have Susan Longabing that has a question. Brandon, can we unmute Susan so she can ask her question to Dr. Washington?
Doesn't look like I have the ability to do that as an attendee. Susan, can you elaborate on your question at all?
So can she unmute herself to ask her question?
No, it doesn't look like as an attendee in the webinar version.
Chat?
Okay, Susan, can you state your question in the chat, please? Okay. I see there's a question from Jovan that says, as a child of the 80s, I'm having a hard time sitting down listening to the music my kids like. Is there a new hip hop act that can help me bridge the gap?
So I must admit that I'm also a child of the 80s, and this is where, like, this is a mistake that I've made, is I've gone into those conversations with young people expecting them to have a particular reverence for the golden age of hip hop, and it creates like this hierarchy where their voices or things that they want to prioritize in the music are devalued or seen as less authentic. And as a counselor, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to be egotistical or erect barriers. So the thing that I've done is, rather than operating from the assumption that their music is so wildly different from the music that I've consumed and grown up on, is just asking, what does the music do for them? What does the music allow them to do and be in the world? And I've often found that when I've been trying to engage students around lyrics that I didn't understand, actually allowing them to narrate and walk me through how the music helps them make meaning of school or relationships has been the most effective in terms of my working with young people in schools. That walking away from the idea, because in many ways that orientation is reminiscent of that banking concept, where I'm trying to enlighten them about these architects and this wonderful history that hip hop, this wonderful and vibrant history that hip hop possesses. And there's time for that. But if I really want to connect, I want to hear and center and situate young people at the center of those conversations, where I'm literally imploring and inviting them to tell me, to translate. What do you hear when you hear Lil Uzi Vert that I'm incapable of hearing, right? And letting that be a bridge into exchanging different forms of music and different forms of Black cultural production that they might not be aware of. So I typically take that approach. And I don't know if that's helpful, but if you want to follow up, we can surely do that.
Good deal. And we have a question from Cadence, and the question is, the Kent School of Social Work here at U of L is working on creating and implementing a new required anti-racist curriculum within their courses. Are there other departments or schools attempting to implement this kind of academic change in learning in U of L? That's for what's happening in the counseling department.
So in ECPY, we've obviously had conversations around how do we not isolate the content in these conversations to not make them static, but to make them more robust, more consistent, and more pervasive throughout what we teach. So although we haven't, as a department, moved towards a total revising of our curriculum, we do think about and talk consistently about those points, content areas where we need to more honestly and more forthrightly talk about issues of racism. One class in particular I'm thinking is testing and measurement. And one of my colleagues used a book called Even the Rat Was White by Robert Guthrie. And coming into my 6:30 class, it was one of the first things that the students discussed as being a very transformative text, and literally helped them to reorient themselves to testing and aptitude and modes of evaluation. So just helping the students to think more critically across the curriculum wherever we can has certainly been a strategy we've been trying to deploy in our department. But to my knowledge, I don't know of any departments where they're doing these like wholesale revisions, but.
Okay, another question. We have Susan's question. The recent dean candidate spoke about using a slow and steady approach to DEI efforts. Yet slow and steady seems to not work to increase the percentage of Black students using traditional admission metrics in CHD to reflect the Louisville population, when the need for Black counselors and teachers is great. What are your thoughts about a slow and steady approach to dismantle anti-Blackness in CHD?
What I will say is, for those of you all who are familiar, and I won't belabor the point, for those of you all who've read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in that letter, he talks specifically about the role of the white moderate and how incrementalism is just to protract the status quo. So I am not at all in favor of slow and methodical, because I think slow and methodical, inevitably, we have to ask, well, who's determining the speed? Who dictates and determines the speed, right? The speed and the pace, right? So unless someone can answer that question in a way that feels comfortable and reassuring, I'm always going to be very, very skeptical of a slow and methodical incrementalist approach.
I agree with you. Slow and methodical sometimes mean nothing's going to happen. That means baby steps, and the urgency is now. The urgency is now.
I do see Monica Wendell, Dr. Wendell, saying that health promotion and behavioral sciences I think that's a really large acronym for something, has transformed its curriculum to include critical pedagogy as a foundational competency. I don't know, it's unfathomable to me that we can graduate students from a college of education, for instance, and have never read Miseducation of the Negro. It's never been a stipulation, ever been a stipulation. Or Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or don't know who Paulo Freire is, right? And my excitement is always subdued because I'm always wondering where the opportunities to do and engage these works more consistently will occur, right? Again, the battle fatigue. How often have we been saying and belaboring the point that things need to change, and they haven't as of yet, right? So to get back to the earlier response and comment about incrementalism, I think we've been entrenched in incrementalism for far too long. We are launching a new degree. Trinidad. All efforts to do anything of this nature have been systematically shut down when brought to. Okay. And I think it's important to acknowledge also, like, I've only been here for 6 years. So I don't know if some of these comments are from folks who have been tenured and seasoned here longer than I have, but I think it's a point that's, worth mentioning, is that, to the point of battle fatigue again, battle fatigue in that form of exhaustion comes from the invitation to the dinner and you're never allowed to prepare any of the meal. Like, I'm tired of getting invited to meals where the things that being served don't serve my system very well.
Absolutely. What I say is, you being invited to, there's a difference between invited to the party and then being to the dance and then being asked to dance, and so or being invited to the table but not having a voice at the table, Absolutely. Any other questions or comments from the attendees? one of the things as we spoke about the LMPD and the Department of Justice is here, and then the new police chief says, okay, well, it's better to uncover things now, or we'll be saying the same thing 5, 10, 15 years from now. But the question becomes, then what, and even many, they have police review committees, and it's found that they have no power, So that's basically, a facade. That's just something, well, let's give them a bone, and let's make sure this too shall pass. But what is the policy and the legislation behind it? Yeah.
Well, the article that I co-authored in 2018 about the relationship between policing and slave patrolling, that's not something that colleagues and students that I've talked to are often not introduced to. So part of the universality, the sort of silencing and invisibility of whiteness is when I hear, and I've heard this several times, but most recently in a conversation at a school where a white teacher was having to grapple with, oh, this is why when I hear the phrase law and order, other people don't respond to the phrase that I do. Like he has a tremendous amount of conviction and belief and confidence in the police. And I simply asked him, I'm like, is it possible that other people have a different relationship, not to that individual police person, because that's also the differentiation between the individual actor and the institution. There are so many folks who are unaware of the origins of contemporary policing. And if we're going to make any sort of profound and sustainable changes in policing, then folks have to really understand how we got here, right? That there was nothing unbiased and neutral about the creation of policing in this country. Absolutely not. And I want that same sort of critical orientation to happen when students step into the arena of education and counseling and consider themselves members of the profession. Like, what does that entail? What is it historically that meant? What have those institutions and entities and belief systems meant for different groups of people? Like counseling and psychology doesn't have a universal meaning in the world, right? Psychology has done and functioned in particular ways based on how folks have been racialized and gendered. Like those are very real conversations that practitioners absolutely need to have. Otherwise, we will be here years from now asking, where do we go from here?
And as you, in one of your slides, you had the apology, but what does that mean? Because we can offer apologies, but what's your next steps what are their next steps in terms of doing something about it?
Well, and that's where I want the students and folks who are listening to really understand, like, what did psychiatry allow? What is the discipline and the discourses of psychiatry and mental health in establishing what a suitable citizen looks like, right? How did psychiatry contribute to our notions around professional aesthetics and professional speech, right? And if we're talking about radical possibilities and making a more inclusive society, we have to start with the actual things that made difference mean something in the world in the first place, right? And those are the disciplines that informed our professional praxis. And I just want to make those things very, very transparent.
And I guess I have a question, and you don't have to name names, but did you have any students, in the counseling profession that was resistant to what was happening? And and what was their take on the why or the non-belief in what was happening?
So this class most recently, the tactic that I perceived was just, that I've not perceived but experienced most frequently was just complete disengagement, right? So having classes where literally only 2 students are speaking because those are the students that are most excited about the content. that's a very real experience, right? So part of racial battle fatigue is living and having to work with the implications of engaging race in a very nuanced way, right? Rather than thinking about, so when I ask students, for instance, when they say that race is a social construction, and I'm asking like, well, what helped to create these ideas and make these ideas so pervasive? They don't think about education, they don't think about counseling, right? So there's so much more work to do in terms of making our work, politicizing our work, and helping students to understand that everything they do in some way, shape, form, or fashion has social and political implications.
Any other questions from the attendees or any lasting comments you'd like to leave with the audience, Dr. Washington? Okay, we have a question. What are some of the classroom curriculum activities you might recommend?
I guess the question is, my response is recommend for what? What are some out of classroom activities like recommend?
Recommend for what, Dr. Sun?
Oh, yeah. So, so if we're in, and I'm thinking about psychology, for instance, when I work with my students in counseling psych or in the department, and they're asking about theories, and they're not asking about theories, and they're working in West Louisville, for instance. And in the instance of our department, they're working at the NIA Center, right? I want to ask the students, like, do you know what NIA represents, what NIA means? And NIA meaning purpose, connected to Kwanzaa and a cultural history, like encouraging students to immerse themselves in the courses that the courses that were often electives, right? So the critical consciousness and the consciousness raising content often comes through the courses that students can elect not to take. So that's why that's why I typically encourage students to start. What classes do you typically opt out of? And the things that you're claiming that you want to learn, I can guarantee you can be found there. You're muted, Dr. Stark.
One of the things that you mentioned about students opting out of diversity in the workforce. You know, we're a diverse university, community, country. To me, it should be a part of every curriculum, not an option, because many people are living in homogeneous communities, and we are more segregated in 2021 than we were in 1965. And so how do you get that? How do you get that understanding? And many people opt out of those classes, and I think it should be a part of the curriculum.
I concur.
Any other questions from anyone? Usually the educator may have me to call on names, and and I see Michelle Penix is in there. Michelle Penix, and you want to say something or have something to say?
Well, I don't know if Michelle wants to say anything, but I'm glad that she's here because when she was at Mill Creek, it was our conversation, one of our earliest conversations. And I appreciated it so much because before she allowed me to even, before I broached the possibility of working in her school, she was very forthcoming about how her consciousness had changed since the Philando Castilla killing, right? And oftentimes when I have these conversations or make these presentations, folks walk away with the assumption that I'm, for some reason want to antagonize white people. And I'm always reminded to emphasize that this is about ideology more than it's about individual actors and actresses. Because if I am a person of color, if I'm a Black person, I can also subscribe to the idea that racism is no longer a problem. And I'm not at all suggesting that this is what Michelle Penix thought, but there have been several encounters that I've had with Black educators who would like to also subscribe to a post-racial, egalitarian vision of America, and also would use Dr. King to, and some of his quotes to achieve or support their arguments, right? So whenever we can deploy a more like race conscious or oppression conscious sort of lens, I think it's advantageous to everyone that we serve. Yes, our time was transformational. Like I remember her presentation, like she had a very, very comprehensive presentation. And as I recall it, understanding the ongoing anti-Blackness that was expressed in the Philander Castillo killing that transpired on Facebook Live was instrumental to understanding the connection between hyper-policing in schools and hyper-policing of Black bodies that happens in our local community. So, wow. Michelle said I was the good Negro until Philander.
And how do we have those courageous conversations? Because many times, as you say, people think that, and I'm of the premise that it's not about shaming or blaming. It's about talking about what is, you know, and how do we get to a point of not being afraid to have those courageous conversations?
Well, I mean, acknowledging the fact that we are actively coerced not to have them. Like, that's a very big first step in acknowledging how we are rewarded for endorsing a colorblind, difference blind perspective, right? I know it's, in terms of progression through the academy, it could be, in terms of the tenure track process, subscribing to a race neutral or a myth of meritocracy sort of approach where you're like, yes, we need to mentor. Like those sorts of discourses are extremely comfortable, stabilizing, and in many ways conservative, right? I was reading Bell Hooks last night. I think it's Black Love as Resistance, or Black Love as Resistance. And in that paper, she talks about the Black bourgeoisie and how the Black bourgeoisie has oftentimes been absolutely instrumental in fostering that idea of, hey, if we simply assimilate and we speak the King's English and we can simply revise how we look, then maybe the world will respond to us differently, right? And critical race theory would simply say, they assassinated Dr. King in a suit. So, right? I just want to be more forthcoming about the ways that we can critique all of the ideologies that reproduce the status quo, even if that means Black respectability politics.
Okay. We have about another 5 minutes, and do we have Erica or Cadence or Michael Smith? Anyone has like to have any comments or questions you'd like to put in the chat or ask Dr. Washington? Not really putting you on the spot, but just giving you an opportunity to offer.
I share, it feels like I'm in class, and I typically, before I conclude class, I share a book, and I don't know if so this book right here is one of my favorites.
Intellectual Warfare, okay?
By Jacob Carruthers. Is a fantastic place to start.
We can put it in the chat, Intellectual Warfare.
By Jacob H. Carruthers.
And we want to thank you all for being here. And Dr. Washington, I truly, truly appreciate you and your work. And I know sometimes we go out, but I also want to make sure, as from the Nystrand Center of Excellence in Education, that we not just go out looking for educators to speak about diversity, equity, inclusion, about whatever, but also to look within the university, and because there is talent, and you are a talent, and congratulations on your becoming tenure. Truly appreciate that.
We'll see. I haven't gotten
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm claiming it. I am claiming it.
I say.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Dr. Washington is going to put the name of the book in the chat, so that you can purchase it if you like. But also know that we all can do something in the spaces and places we occupy. Many times, people say, "Oh, I can't do anything. It's too much for me to do." But we all can do something in the spaces and places that we occupy. It's about having the courage to do something. And again, bad things happen when good people stand by and do nothing. So you can do something. So we are empowering you to have the courage to do something.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Stark, for the invitation.
Mm-hmm.
I've thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to discuss these things with you and everyone else on the call, and invite folks to reach out. I would love to extend these conversations. I've had several students recently in my classes express a desire to engage with decolonization more. So I'm always thinking about and wanting to explore opportunities to make these sorts of conversation happen more consistently on campus. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And as I say, that how do we have those conversations? I want to make sure the Nystrand Center of Excellence in Education provide the opportunities to have the conversations that we so desperately need. So thank you, everyone. Truly appreciate it. And for the Nystrand Center, we're happy that you've been in attendance at our forum. So we're going to take a break for June and July, and we'll see you back in August for additional forums.
Dr. Washington, if you'd like to transfer back the host permissions to me, and I'll make sure we stop recording and get us all tied up.
And also for those who are still here, we always record these forums, so that if you like to use it for your class or somewhere, it's on the Nystrand Center page of events, so that you can use it for this topic or this discussion in your classes if you so desire, or community.
Brandon, how do I can't find where I relinquish the share host capabilities?
If you look at me under the participants and then the panelists column, and if you click my name, you should have the more option.
So what do I make you a host?
Yes, if you do that, that should transfer it back to me, and we can. Yes, here we go. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.